By the time the paperwork was finished, the inmate had already been moved to the security housing unit, cut off from general population without a hearing in open court. Inside Pelican Bay State Prison in Northern California, that transfer carried weight. The facility was designed for isolation, and its SHU became known for housing validated prison gang members. During the late 1980s and 1990s, California prison officials expanded policies aimed at controlling gang activity, arguing that tightly organized groups were driving violence behind the walls. Pelican Bay, opened in 1989 near Crescent City, quickly became the state's primary tool for managing those labeled as members or associates of prison gangs. But the process that placed someone in the SHU did not always require a new criminal act. It often relied on something called gang validation. Gang validation was an internal classification procedure. Instead of a criminal conviction, prison investigators gathered evidence to determine whether an inmate met criteria for gang membership. Officials from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, known as CDCR, used confidential informants, written materials, tattoos, and association patterns to build validation cases. 3 independent source items were generally required. At least one had to be a direct link to a recognized gang member or documented gang activity. Those sources could include letters referencing gang symbols, drawings found in a cell, or testimony from another inmate who agreed to cooperate. Critics argued that the threshold was lower than most people realized. A birthday card with certain imagery or a photocopied article could be interpreted as evidence. Once validated, inmates were typically assigned to the SHU for an indeterminate term, meaning there was no fixed release date back to general population. The official justification was prevention. Administrators believed isolating leaders and recruiters would weaken gang influence throughout the broader prison system. But for the person labeled, the consequences were immediate and severe. 22 to 24 hours a day were spent alone in a concrete cell. Visits were restricted. Phone calls were limited. Educational and vocational programs were largely unavailable in the SHU environment. The classification decision was made internally, not by a judge. It was reviewed through administrative channels within the prison system. Supporters of the policy maintained that traditional disciplinary tools were ineffective against highly organized prison gangs operating across facilities. They pointed to documented histories of groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, and the Black Guerrilla family influencing violence statewide. Investigators were trained to identify symbols, codes, and communication patterns associated with those organizations. Yet, the secrecy surrounding the validation process created tension. Much of the evidence used was confidential, and inmates were not always told the source. That meant challenging the designation could be difficult. An inmate might know he had been labeled but not know exactly why. Prison officials argued confidentiality protected informants from retaliation. Without secrecy, they said, few inmates would cooperate. Civil rights advocates countered that secrecy also reduced accountability, increasing the risk of error or abuse. The stakes were high because validation often led to years in solitary confinement at Pelican Bay's SHU. By the early 2000s, hundreds of men were housed there under gang validation status, some for more than a decade. For many, release from the SHU required one of 2 paths. Either they agreed to debrief, or they waited for policy changes. Debriefing meant providing detailed information about gang structure and members. In exchange, inmates could be reclassified and transferred out of the SHU. But debriefing carried risks. Those who cooperated were often labeled informants and could face retaliation if returned to general population. As a result, some inmates chose to remain in isolation rather than provide information about others. Others insisted they were never gang members at all and saw debriefing as an admission of something they denied. This created a cycle. The longer someone stayed in the SHU, the more their file accumulated documentation reinforcing the original label. Periodic reviews were conducted, but critics argued they rarely resulted in release without debriefing. What made the system especially controversial was the breadth of evidence considered acceptable. Possessing certain artwork, literature, or contact lists could be interpreted as gang-related material. Investigators relied on intelligence units within CDCR, sometimes called institutional gang investigators, to assess these materials. Those investigators compiled reports summarizing the evidence, which were then used in validation hearings. In many cases, the hearing did not resemble a courtroom proceeding. It was an administrative review behind closed doors. Inmates could submit written statements, but they did not cross-examine confidential informants. Legal challenges began to surface, questioning whether the process met constitutional standards of due process. Courts generally granted prison officials broad discretion in managing security, but scrutiny increased over time. Advocacy groups collected testimonies from former SHU inmates describing years of isolation based solely on validation. Some described learning of their designation after routine cell searches uncovered materials later classified as gang-related. Others said association was inferred because they communicated with certain individuals on yard or through mail. Prison officials maintained that patterns of association were key indicators of organized activity. They argued that gang structures inside California prisons were hierarchical and resilient, requiring proactive disruption. However, critics warned that the validation model blurred the line between suspected affiliation and proven misconduct. That distinction mattered because validated inmates were often housed in windowless cells measuring roughly 8 by 10 feet. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation became part of the public debate surrounding Pelican Bay. Researchers and mental health experts testified in court cases about the impact of extended solitary confinement. Meanwhile, CDCR defended its approach as necessary for controlling violence across a system housing tens of thousands. Few outside observers initially understood how someone could be confined for years without a new disciplinary infraction. But internal documents revealed that the label itself was often enough. And once that label was applied, removing it proved far more difficult than many expected. For some inmates, the only formal notice came in a thin packet of documents listing coded references and brief summaries prepared by prison investigators. The packet might cite confidential memoranda, intercepted correspondence, or artwork interpreted as gang symbolism under CDCR guidelines. Often, the inmate could not see the full evidence because sources were redacted to protect informants and ongoing investigations. That limited visibility shaped the entire appeal process, since challenging unknown accusations proved inherently difficult. Under California regulations, inmates were entitled to periodic reviews of their SHU placement, typically every 6 years during certain periods. But those reviews largely reassessed existing documentation rather than re-examining the original validation from the beginning. If no new information disproved gang affiliation, the status often remained unchanged. As years passed, validation files sometimes grew thicker, not thinner, as additional notes were added to support continued confinement. Some inmates filed internal grievances arguing that artwork, books, or cultural symbols had been misinterpreted as gang indicators. Others claimed they were validated based on association alone, such as sharing a yard with someone already labeled a gang member. Prison officials responded that association patterns were central to identifying organized influence within facilities. They maintained that gangs operated through coded communication, making traditional disciplinary evidence difficult to obtain. This intelligence-driven model prioritized prevention over punishment for a specific act. But critics questioned whether preventive classification could justify indefinite isolation without fresh misconduct. The issue drew broader attention during statewide hunger strikes beginning in 2011. Hundreds of inmates, many housed at Pelican Bay's SHU, refused meals to protest long-term solitary confinement and validation policies. Their demands included clearer criteria for gang validation and meaningful pathways out of the SHU without mandatory debriefing. The strikes gained national media coverage and prompted legislative hearings in California. Lawmakers began asking how evidence was evaluated and whether safeguards were strong enough to prevent mistakes. Testimony revealed that some validations relied on decades-old information. In certain cases, minor references in letters had been interpreted as coded messages linked to specific prison gangs. Civil rights organizations argued that context was often missing from those interpretations. They contended that cultural pride symbols, historical figures, or geographic references were sometimes treated as gang-related without sufficient corroboration. CDCR officials countered that trained investigators relied on accumulated intelligence databases and years of institutional experience. They emphasized that 3 independent source items were still required for validation. However, what qualified as an independent source remained controversial. 2 different documents referencing similar content could be counted separately if they came from distinct origins. This technical distinction became central in later court challenges. Inmates and advocates argued that overlapping evidence could create an illusion of corroboration without true independence. Meanwhile, the daily reality inside the SHU continued largely unchanged. Cells were constructed from poured concrete, with minimal human contact beyond routine checks by correctional staff. Exercise typically occurred in small, enclosed yards sometimes referred to as dog runs. Communication between inmates was restricted, though some still managed limited exchanges through vents or during brief yard rotations. For validated inmates, the possibility of release often hinged on either debriefing or a change in policy. Many hesitated to debrief because it required naming others and detailing organizational structures. Officials described debriefing as a security tool to dismantle gang hierarchies. Critics described it as coercive, arguing it forced inmates to choose between isolation and becoming informants. The debate intensified as mental health experts presented research linking prolonged solitary confinement to anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline. Federal courts began examining whether California's policies met constitutional standards under the 8th Amendment. One major case, Ashker versus Governor of California, brought together a class of Pelican Bay SHU inmates challenging indefinite isolation. The plaintiffs argued that holding inmates for years based solely on gang validation, without serious misconduct, violated due process and humane treatment standards. In 2015, a settlement agreement significantly changed how California used solitary confinement for gang affiliation. CDCR agreed to end indefinite SHU terms based solely on validation status. Instead, placement in restrictive housing would require recent serious misconduct tied to gang activity. Thousands of inmates statewide were reevaluated under the new policy framework. Many who had spent years, and in some cases decades, in the SHU were transferred to general population units. The agreement also introduced a step-down program intended to transition inmates gradually out of isolation. This marked a fundamental shift from status-based confinement toward behavior-based discipline. However, questions remained about how earlier validations had been made. For some former SHU inmates, release did not erase the years already spent in isolation. Legal scholars pointed to Pelican Bay as a case study in how administrative classification can reshape a person's life without a criminal trial. Supporters of the old system argued that violence in California prisons declined during periods when validation policies were aggressively enforced. They viewed gang isolation as a necessary response to coordinated threats. Opponents argued that correlation did not prove causation and that long-term isolation carried profound human costs. The controversy forced broader reflection on how prisons define and detect gang membership. It also exposed how much authority correctional agencies hold over internal classifications. For inmates at Pelican Bay, the label of gang member was not symbolic. It determined housing, movement, privileges, and the amount of human contact allowed each day. And for years, once applied, that label functioned almost like a permanent sentence within a sentence. Even after policy reforms, the legacy of gang validation at Pelican Bay continued to shape public debate about prison oversight and internal intelligence systems. Former SHU inmates described the validation label as something that followed them long after transfer out of solitary confinement. Although the 2015 settlement reduced status-based isolation, prison officials retained authority to monitor suspected gang activity through revised classification tools. CDCR implemented new regulations requiring clearer behavioral evidence before placing someone in restrictive housing. The shift signaled recognition that affiliation alone was no longer sufficient grounds for indefinite isolation. Yet understanding how earlier validations occurred remained essential to evaluating the system as a whole. Institutional gang investigators had relied heavily on accumulated intelligence files, some dating back many years. Those files included confidential debriefing reports from other inmates who had agreed to provide information. Debriefing statements were often treated as high-value intelligence because they offered inside descriptions of gang structure. However, defense attorneys argued that such statements were rarely subject to independent verification. An inmate could be validated based partly on being named in another person's debriefing narrative. Because those narratives were confidential, the accused often had limited ability to refute them directly. Prison officials maintained that corroboration standards were applied before relying on any single informant. Still, critics questioned whether internal review procedures provided enough transparency. The broader issue centered on how prisons balance security with procedural fairness. Inside correctional institutions, administrators are granted significant discretion to prevent violence. Courts historically defer to prison officials on matters of internal safety. But Pelican Bay's SHU became a focal point for testing the limits of that deference. The Ashker settlement did not declare past policies unconstitutional through trial findings. Instead, it resolved the lawsuit through negotiated reform without formal admission of wrongdoing. That left ongoing disagreement about whether earlier validation practices were fundamentally flawed or simply overly broad. Some correctional leaders argued that gang influence within California prisons had been severe and deeply organized. They pointed to documented assaults, coordinated disturbances, and extortion schemes tied to structured prison groups. From their perspective, isolating validated leaders disrupted communication channels that fueled violence. Opponents countered that isolation based on symbolic evidence risked sweeping up individuals who were not active participants. They emphasized that administrative classification carries consequences comparable to additional punishment. The conversation expanded beyond California as other states examined their own gang management policies. National prison reform advocates cited Pelican Bay as evidence of how internal intelligence systems can grow opaque. Meanwhile, families of SHU inmates described years of limited contact and uncertainty about release. Some inmates who left the SHU entered general population units after more than a decade of isolation. Transitioning back required adjustment to regular yard access, social interaction, and program participation. CDCR developed structured reintegration steps designed to ease that transition. Even so, the psychological impact of prolonged solitary confinement remained a subject of academic study. Medical professionals testified that extended isolation can affect sleep patterns, concentration, and emotional regulation. Those findings influenced how policymakers framed the debate about restrictive housing nationwide. By the late 2010s, California significantly reduced the number of inmates housed in long-term solitary units. Pelican Bay's SHU population dropped from hundreds to a fraction of its earlier size. The facility itself remained open, but its role evolved under new regulations. Gang validation still existed as a classification category, but it no longer automatically triggered indefinite isolation. Placement decisions required clearer links to recent serious misconduct. Supporters of reform argued that this realignment restored emphasis on behavior rather than status. Critics of reform worried that reducing isolation might allow organized groups to regain influence. The tension between security and civil rights continues to define the conversation. What remains clear is that, for decades, validation at Pelican Bay functioned as a powerful administrative mechanism. It operated largely outside public view, embedded within correctional policy rather than criminal courtrooms. For inmates affected by it, the label shaped daily life in concrete and steel surroundings. For policymakers, it raised enduring questions about oversight, transparency, and proportionality. The story of gang validation at Pelican Bay illustrates how internal prison decisions can carry consequences lasting years. It also shows how litigation, public scrutiny, and policy reform can reshape even deeply entrenched correctional practices. Long after individual cases fade from headlines, the institutional lessons remain relevant. Because behind every classification code and internal memorandum is a human life altered by that determination. And the debate over how those determinations are made is far from settled. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.